All right, folks, let's get started. This is going to be chapter 3, cryptography of your textbook. Let's get started. This is a long chapter and there are about 70 slides. So I am going to skip over some of the slides that are self-explanatory. You can read about it, but go to the important slides. And the reason I'm doing that is, that's I want to keep the lecture short, and by short I mean cover the chapter, but there are 70 slides, so it'll take at least an hour for me to cover it. All right, let's get started, folks. Very quickly, the learning objectives here is we'll go through the concepts of cryptography, describe symmetric key encryption, and the importance of the key length. We'll also explain what the negotiation stage is, and in fact, we'll talk about what stage is. We'll look at the initial authentication, including MS-JAP, describe keying, and include the public key encryption, explain how electronic signatures, including the digital signatures, digital certificates, and key hash message authentication code, which is HMAC, work. We will describe the public key encryption for authentication, describe quantum security, explain cryptographic systems like VPN, SSL, and IPsec. So this chapter packs a lot of information, and I really implore you to read the book because it's got a lot of material that I possibly can't cover without going into hours and hours of lecture. So I will try to hit the high points as well as hit some of the points that are maybe easier explained than reading, or at least it'll help you in your understanding of the reading. But let's go from there, right? So this is by no means a complete comprehensive lecture that can cover every topic. There's a lot to cover, but it'll give you a great starting point. Okay, to ground ourselves, let's take a look at this slide and make sure that we understand that on this roadmap, we are on cryptography, which is part of the PROTECT protocol. We looked at our entire threat environment, and in chapter 2, you read about policy and planning that needs to happen. But now we are in this PROTECT realm, and we are at the cryptography section here, right? So skipping over some of the orientation slides here. So what is cryptography? Cryptography is the use of mathematical operations to protect the messages traveling between parties or stored on a computer. So you can see that we are trying to protect messages that are traveling or when we are storing them on the computer. Okay. Confidentiality means that someone intercepting your communication cannot read them. The confidentiality is about a man in the middle, let's say, trying to understand your message. Not only is he able to read them, uh, also not be able to change it on its way to the recipient. That's also important, right? So what is cryptography? Cryptography is, confidentiality is only one of cryptographic protection. We also get authentication. That means, is the person that is sending you the message in the first place, are they authenticated? Do you trust the source of this message? Integrity means that the message cannot be changed, or if it is changed, that the change will be detected and you can figure out what was changed, right? So this is known, the tenet is known as CIA, and that is not new to you. Three very important terms. One is a cipher. Now remember, cipher is a mathematical method. This is important for you to understand because we don't necessarily need to understand exactly what the mathematical model or method is happening. We just to need to understand that cipher is a mathematical tool that you're going to use. Use for what? To encrypt and decrypt, both encrypt and decrypt. Okay, so that the tenet here is that the cipher cannot be or should not be kept secret. Why? Uh, well, what if you don't tell anybody what cipher you're using? Well, guess what? There are a limited number of ciphers that are out there. So if you are trying to keep that secret, it's not going to last for long. What is important is that key, and you need to keep the key secret. So just understand that that is what Kirchhoff law is trying to tell you. It's in two parts. First part, it says that there's no need to keep the cipher a secret, and the second part is that the key or or the keys must be kept secret, and that's the second part of the law. Okay, what is a key? Actually, key is merely a long stream of bits, ones and zeros, that you're going to use for as part of your input when you're trying to encrypt and then decrypt it. All right, so let's look at symmetric key encryption for confidentiality. In symmetric key encryption, the key that the sender has and the key that the receiver has is just the same. It's exact same key you both need to have to be able to do this. Now we start with, there are some terms here that I would love for you to pay attention to. One is this plain text. Plain text is what you start with. So hello in this case. And then you have the cipher. Remember, cipher is your mathematical model and a key. You need both cipher and the key. So we are talking about this. And from that, you can derive what is known as the ciphertext. Ciphertext is after you have done the cipher on your plain text, this is what you get, ciphertext. It is sent over the network, and on the other side, you just kind of roll it in the opposite direction to get to your plain text. So from ciphertext, you use the cipher, and you use the key to get back to your plain text that you started with. All right. So a single key is used to encrypt and decrypt in both directions. The key here is a single key. All right, the keyword here is not so much anything other than single here. All right, so that's how the party A and party B will talk to each other. So here's an example. N moves 4 spaces and becomes an R. So the whole text here can be moved different number of places to move to create your ciphertext, and not all the letters need to move by the same, even though they're the same letter, they don't need to make the same hop. So I over here is making 16 hops, while I over here makes 20 hops, and same for E. You can see that that's different, 9 versus 25. So now there are two different types of ciphers that we use. One is the substitution type cipher, and one is the transposition cipher. In substitution cipher, you just saw that in the previous slide. I'm going to take the letter that I'm supposed to be using and just simply substitute it for some other letter. So N gets substituted by R, right? But in case of transposition cipher, I move things around. And in most real ciphers, both substitution and transposition is used. So how is transposition done? So there's one way of doing it. Very, very simple transposition going on here. So I create myself a column and a row, and I randomly choose row numbers here and column numbers here, write my message down, and then I say, okay, position column 1, row 1 will be my first alphabet. So 1, 1 is H, and then column 1, row 2, which is N, is going to be my second, and row 3 is going to be my third. So now we're going to talk about the difference between cipher and code. Cipher is, as you saw, you are either substituting or you are transposing your characters, or in this case, binaries, ones and zeros. You're doing a bit by bit operation there. Codes, on the other hand, are more specialized in the sense that they, and I'll move on to the next slide to give you an example. I can use words and substitute them with a number, and that word and number pair might be different, but you have a translation book like this one shown here. If I get this number, I should be able to use my handy dandy translation book to go back to the message that was sent. Okay, so going back to our slide here, codes are more specialized. They substitute one thing for another, usually a word or another word, or a number for a word. Moving on, what is key now? Key, as you remember, like we did in the example of the matrix, it's the key that is used with your cipher to create the ciphertext. And as the key size grows, the number of permutation of the keys that you have to guess grows as well, right? If you had only one bit, you would have just two guesses. That means 0 or 1, right? And if you had two keys, it'll be 2 raised to the power of 2, which is 4, right? So every time you change the the bit, you actually go up by 2. So when you went from 2 to 4, you actually went from 4 times 2 is 8 times 2 is 16. So you went double twice to get to 16. And you can see how that number grows, right? So by the time you reach 256, you got these many different combinations that you have to try if you are trying to brute force guess exactly what the code is. And that's where we have a more safer system, if you would, with more bits in your key. So that is important to remember, and we'll come back to private public keys. That's why when you talk about private keys, you need to have this private key really, really long for you to make it impossible to guess, or make it so hard to guess that people can just give up, because that's not worth their time to get the information you're trying to hide. We see that this is a chart that's kind of showing how the size of the key actually helps create a good cipher. So as you can see that when the key size is small, you get very weak key strength. DES, which is the digital encryption system, has got only key length of 56, and it gives you a weak protection. Triple DES, which is 3 DES, is giving you these many characters or bit length in your key, and so it is much stronger. Look at what happens when you get AES, which is Advanced Encryption System. You get very strong cipher, and it is today's gold standard, because it actually, if you remember, look at this part, it actually doesn't it uses low processing and RAM requirement for you to do this. So it is definitely the preferred encryption today. So DES, which is the digital encryption system, this is how it works. You take the plain text block and you do it 64 bit at a time, and you apply a 64-bit DES symmetric key to it, which out of which 56 bits plus 8 are redundant bits, and you create you put it through the encryption process, you get the cipher text. And to get to the plain text, you just do exactly the opposite. You take the cipher text, take the key, and you put it through the system of decryption, and you'll get back the plain text. Cryptographic system has actually many different parts to it, right? Encryption for confidentiality is only one part of it, right? So you're encrypting so that the message that you're sending is not visible as a plain text to somebody else, right? And it's important to remember that individual users or corporations cannot, not everybody is a mad genius. They would not be able to use these encryption and decryption on their own. So we get these well built and well tested encryption and decryption algorithms that we have adopted and we are using. And the only reason we do that is we know exactly what kind of system that we are talking about, what kind of cipher we are talking about, and we are also making it easy for anybody to go ahead and use these. So how do we do that? The way we do that is we have both parties actually negotiate with each other that what are they going to use. And then once that has been figured out that what am I going to use, and we'll see that in a diagram in a few seconds here, that each cryptographic system, that's why it begins with 3 brief handshake stages, and we'll see more and more of this as we go along. And the two parties then engage in the cryptographically protected communication, because now they know exactly how to talk to each other in a safe manner. So let's take a look at the diagram here. So handshake in stage 1 is initial negotiation of security parameters. In other words, the client PC might send to the server all the different encryption methodologies that it can support. And then server returns and says, okay, out of that, I'm going to choose this particular cipher suite. What is a cipher suite? We'll look at that. Okay. Then what they do is they do an initial authentication. In other words, client PC is making sure that the server it's talking to is actually the server that they're intending to talk to. It's really google.com and nobody else that is pretending to be google.com. And the same thing sometimes for server, the bank is trying to find out whether the client is actually the client that they should be talking to. And then once that is done, all this is clear, we go to stage 3 where we exchange a key or parameters to create a key, and we create ourselves the same key. Once we have done that, we can do an ongoing communication using that key. Remember, the key that we generate over here is only valid for the duration of this communication. Once you come back in again and the session has expired, you would have to generate another key, which might lead you to go through these steps again. So this is the electronic signature sitting right here, and this is the plain text that you want to um, send to the server, and the whole thing is encrypted for confidentiality, so nobody else takes a look at it and sent over. Server is able to then break these down, make sure that it is coming from the right place, so authentication and integrity is valid, and then it takes a look at plain text and figures out what the message is. So these are cipher suites. So what is a cipher suite? Okay, let's look at how the cipher suites are built. What are cipher suites? Cipher suites make the client and server understand each other as to how are they going to negotiate the key, how are they going to create a digital signature, how are they going to exchange the symmetric key? Because remember, um, when client and server talk to each other, they just cannot use asymmetric communication all the time. And we'll look at the difference between asymmetric and symmetric. They have to do the initial part of it in an asymmetric manner using public-private key. And once they have established a session, they want to do the rest of their session talking, exchanging data using symmetric key, which takes a lot less resources for them to do, so that they can do that, right? Look at the first example, null with null, null, null. That means I don't have any key negotiation here, none. I have no digital signature method, no. I don't use any symmetric key encryption, and I don't use any hashing. So, guess what? The strength is none. And then it shows all different combinations, RSA using RC4 and MD5, and it's weak. So for asymmetric part, we use RSA. For symmetric part, we use AES 256, and then for hashing, we use SHA 256. So how do we do authentication? Authentication, there are a few terms to remember here. One is the supplicant, is the person who is trying to send a message over claiming to be somebody. So it's somebody that's trying to prove that I am me, okay? And they send their credentials. Credentials are proof of identity. And they send it to the verifier that's going to test to make sure that this is the person that they claim to be the person, okay? So how do we do that? Well, we have various different methods, and we'll take a look at that. But the credentials are can be checked using third party, using verifier's own database, and so forth. We're going to jump a little bit and take a look at hashing. Well, what is hashing? Hashing is an algorithm that is applied to a bit of string of any length, and what happens, what results from that is called a hash. Think of it as a hopper where you create a package, and no matter what you put into the hopper, and it's kind of hard to imagine that, whatever you put into the hopper, it'll come out looking like a brown paper package which has the exact same size. So it is very hard for you to, and it's only one way. There's no way you can look at that package and figure out where it started, what was put into the hopper, right? So what uses that? Well, what you can do is you can take your password, create a hash of it, and you send the hash over to the server. Let's say server has your password, it pulls the password out and hashes the password and then matches the hash and says, okay, I see the hashes are same, therefore the password is correct. So in that entire chain, nobody actually sent the password over in plain text, nor did the server uh, know what the password actually is. It's always looking and comparing the hash. So once again, we talked about encryption and hashing. The difference here is that encryption is reversible. You see that here. Hashing is not reversible. There's no way to get the original back here. On the other hand, encryption produces about the same length as the plain text. Okay, hashing, nope, it always has a fixed length, which is an advantage. There's no way anybody can figure out whether you said one character or 5,000 characters. They might just create the same hash of 256 characters. So here are some of the hashing algorithms. MD5, it's got a key length of 128 bit. Not very good. You know what this means is that 2 raised to the power 128 guesses would be able to break this hash, right? SHA-1 160, slight improvement, still not very good. SHA-224, 256, and 384 and 512, and you can see the key size is it produces tremendous amount of different combinations you can have of the hash. So it's almost impossible to brute force. There are less collisions. What is a collision? Collision is that you started off with two different um, initial set of bits and they create the exact same hash. It can happen. It's called a birthday collision, but it gets rarer and rarer as you go up the chain to SHA-512. MD5 and SHA-1 should not be used because they have been shown to be very unsecure. Let's get into the Microsoft's world of CHAP, Challenge Response Authentication Protocol. Now, this is outside of Microsoft. It's not super popular. And what's going on here is nicely shown in this figure. The verifier creates challenge message. Challenge message is sent over to supplicant or the client. Remember now, supplicant is the one that is trying to prove who I am, and verifier is the one that is gonna need to verify whether this is the right person or not. So supplicant, what does supplicant do? It creates a response message, adds a password to the challenge message, hashes the resultant bit string. Okay, it's not encrypting it, just hashing that bit, and then hash is the response message, right? So it sends back that hashing, and what verifier is going to do is, and let's look at the rest of it. Applicant sends the response message to the clear text, right? Transmit a response. Now the verifier is going to take that and it'll do its own hashing, right? And it'll look at the expected response, which is this. Now the transmitted response and expected response, if they don't match, then you know that it's not the message that was intended by the sender, right? Um, remember the challenge that it was sent earlier? That's what's going on here. Again, note that only hashing is involved. There's no encryption going on here. You're just taking the message, putting it through hash, and then comparing the hash on both sides. Okay. Now let's talk a little bit about keys. Keys are an interesting concept. In symmetric key is, as you remember, it's an input to cipher. You guys remember that, right? So you have your plain text, you have your key, put it into the cipher, and out comes ciphertext. And then ciphertext can then be reversed if you knew exactly what the key was, and you can get back the plain text, right? In symmetric key, both of you need to have the same key. That means you, the sender, and the receiver, they both need to have the same set of symmetric key that can then, turn plain text into ciphertext or ciphertext back into plain text, right? In a public key encryption method, it's also called asymmetric. Each party has a public key and a private key. So you have a public key and a private key. The receiver has a public key and a private key, right? Private key is never shared. It's only the public key. Now, here's the part that you got to remember. is that, and I'm going to show that within the next diagram, is that I have to use my private key to create something that can be opened with my public key. Okay, so if I encrypt a message I'm sending to Bob using Bob's public keys are available to everybody. So I, sitting over here, I'm, let's say, Alice. Alice can actually encrypt a message with Bob's public key. Guess what? When I send it over, it can actually only be decrypted with Bob's private key. So nobody else can read that message. What did we just satisfy? It is satisfying the confidentiality. That means the encrypted message, cannot be read by somebody else. But is it satisfying authenticity? That means, can you figure out who sent this message? You can't, right? Anybody that has Bob's public key, which is practically everybody, can create a message that Bob is reading, but it cannot verify if the message really came from Alice. Okay. If, on the other hand, going the other direction, if now you encrypt with Alice's public key, send it over, it can only be depicted with Alice's private key. So you guys understand that as you send things over from person A to person B and you use their public key, then person B is the only one that can read it, right? Public key for symmetric session goes this way. So first you create symmetric session key, okay? Then you encrypt the session key with the party B's public key and send it over. Now party B will get your session and will know what the symmetric key is. And after that, you can forget about this public private key. You can start communicating with the symmetric key that we just got. And the reason for that is it's very expensive to do this public private key because the decryption is harder. It takes a uh, lot of resources to do that. As compared to that, symmetric key is faster. So we want to gravitate to symmetric key, and we can send the symmetric key over using this methodology. So what happens in Diffie-Hellman? Diffie-Hellman is an amazing concept, and I would highly encourage you to go read that up in detail. And I think I have a slide later on that kind of describes it. The two parties exchange parameters P and G. So let's say Bob and Alice, they exchange P and G, okay? And each uses a number that is never shared explicitly, compute a second number. So what it tells me is, like, for example, Bob chooses a number called Bob's number and Alice chooses a number called Alice's number, okay? And the way this works is, they would only need to send each other P and G, but they never send Bob's number and Alice's number over the line, but they can actually now get to that exact same key using this, okay? So since we are sending P and G over in clear text, and why are we doing that? That's because even if somebody picks up P and G, they still don't know Bob's secret number and Alice's secret number. They would not be able to create um, that exact key that everybody is using. All right, so it's time to take a look at the gory details that are part of the Diffie-Hellman key agreement. Now, I'm going to oversimplify all of this, and it's important for us to kind of understand what are we trying to achieve and how we achieve it, and the mathematical details. If you're interested, you have lots of different sources. You can look that up. So let's start at the beginning. There's a party X and party Y. They would like to communicate using symmetric key algorithm, right? Um, but in order for them to do that, they need to exchange this symmetric key. Well, therein lies the problem, because if you put it on the wire, somebody can eavesdrop. So Diffie-Hellman is a way to circumvent that. How do we do that? So first, there's if you remember, as part of the three-way handshake, there is a exchange of keying information. So what is that? So one of the parties, the party X in this case, could be you, and party Y could be Google. So you decide to send, let's say, Google a prime number P. Let's say you pick 23 at random, and G, let's say 5 at random, and you send that over to Google, right? In addition to that, party X and party Y both independently come up with their secret number. So in our case, um, party X comes up with X, let's say, and party Y comes up with its own number Y. Now that's a secret number they're just going to hold on to. But what they do is create this item in red that you see over here, X prime, and on the Google side is Y prime. And the way they do that is G raised to power of x mod p. Then remember, for party x, g was already sent over, x is their secret number, and mod is a modulus operation. So g raised to power x mod p is calculated on this side, and y prime, which is g raised to power y mod p, is calculated on the Google side. Now, what happens at the end of that? Once you have calculated x prime and y prime, you exchange the x prime and y prime. Okay, it is exchanged in clear text because, as we'll see, nobody, even though they might be eavesdropping, they really cannot do anything about it. And why is it done in clear text? Because remember, exchanging information in clear text is a lot less compute intense as compared to exchanging in ciphertext, because you got another step to decipher what you're sending over the wire. So if you don't need to, you don't want to send things in ciphertext, you would send in clear text. So you end up exchanging x prime and y prime. Now, next step, party x computes something called y prime, which it got from party y, raised to power of x that it knows, mod p. And on the party y side, you do kind of the same thing, but we do it with x prime that was sent over by party x. So I do x prime raised to power y mod p. Y is the secret party y number that we did in step 2 here. Guess what? When we do this, this actually turns out to be the same on both sides. This is actually equal to g raised to the generator raised to power of x y mod p. Now, obviously we didn't calculate this number because we don't know what y is, but we did this number, which happens to be equal to this, and we know every part of this. Same thing over here. We didn't really calculate this, but we know x prime that was sent over, and we have our secret y, and we know what the value of p is. Boom. What happens at the end of this step? We have a symmetric session key, which is shown right here. And from this point onwards, we can use that information. Now remember, an eavesdropper intercepting the keying information, which is in step 1 and step 4 here, they would obviously come to know what is p, what is y, what is x prime and y prime, but they don't know x or y, and that is important, right? So they cannot really back calculate, if you would, x or y from the information that's provided. Even if they were trying to do that, it's going to take an enormous amount of time, and that's something that will, if you read the mathematical details, you'll see that, right? So that's, in short, how Diffie-Hellman helps you arrive at a symmetric key by just exchanging parts of information, not the whole. You can look up Google for Diffie-Hellman, and it kind of explains this with paint. Some folks have used other analogies, but it basically boils down to what you see here. So moving on to ongoing communication. Now that you have established a common key, how do you do the ongoing communication? So now you do message by message encryption. This encryption is done using what? Symmetric key. Now you have symmetric key. Okay. Um, why are you doing that? You could have used public key encryption, but it is too inefficient. So what did you do? If you remember, we did this private public key just to send message, just to do initial handshaking, right? And once we have established the key, we don't really have to do um, public key encryption anymore. We can do symmetric key encryption after that. Okay, message by message authentication. Now, how do we do authentication in message by message. What does it mean by that? It means that you would be able to prove that the message came from you and the message is actually what you intended to send. So it covers integrity. That means the message has not been modified. It actually has authentication built into it. Okay. All right, so let's see how this is done. So remember, what we are trying to do here is simply authentication. So how do we authenticate? All right, and how do we make sure that at the same time your message is exactly what it is? So we are also taking care of the integrity. So what you do is you take your plain text, that's your message, you put it through a hash. You get what is known as the message digest. All right. Now, what you're going to do is encrypt that with the sender's private key. Okay, so you are sending the message. You take your message, turn this into message digest, and you encrypt it using your private key. You're the sender of the message, your private key. All right, and then you send the DS, which is the digital signature, and the plain text over. What you do is you take your digital signature and your plain text and you transmit that over to where you want to send. When you're doing that, you would actually be using encryption, which is part of your message sending mechanism to do the encryption here. So you're doing a symmetric key encryption to send the message over. Remember, as you negotiated the symmetric key, and we went through that a couple slides ago. You're going to use that for sending this message over to the receiver. All right. So now the receiver is going to take a look at it and is going to do a few things here. Is that as they got the raw message on the line, they first put it through symmetric decryption and they got the plain text. But how do they trust the plain text now? We take that plain text and convert that into the message digest. Now they take the digital signature that was also sent in, and I'm going to just refresh your memory. This is a digital signature that was sent, and if I go back, digital signature is what? Digital signature is signing the message digest with the sender's private key, right? So I should be able to, if I go here, I should be able to um, apply a sender's public key to figure out what the message digest is, and I should be able to compare these two and say, are they equal? Yes, then I can trust this message came from the sender. Now here's the part that you have to pay very good attention to. Now when you are using the sender's public key, you don't actually rely on the sender that send you the message for that public key. This is the important part. Again, I'm going to repeat it slowly. When you're trying to use a public key to go from the digital signature to the message digest, you don't use the sender's public key, but you go to a trusted third party, ask for the sender's public key. And the reason for that is if this was being sent by a hacker, and it actually they could send you a public key that they know that's going to work with their message and create this messaging digest, right? You don't want to do that. So let's say if it is coming from Google, you don't want to trust somebody sending you that information to tell you what Google's public key is. You want to go to a certificate authority and ask them for the public key of Google and check that, decrypt this message, create this message digest, and see if it is equal to the message digest that was sent to you. All right, the two match, it's authenticated. So what did that tell you? That tells you that you used Google's key to decrypt, so this message must have come from Google, and B, it is telling you it can only have come from Google. Nobody else can send it because they don't have Google's private key, right? Hope that makes sense to you. So again, kind of making the same point, public key encryption for confidentiality. This is the receiver's public key and the receiver's private key. Okay, so encryption goal is public key encryption for confidentiality. This is sender encrypts it with the receiver's public key. Receiver decrypts it with receiver's private key. Public key encryption for authentication. Actually, senders uses sender's private key to authenticate, and then the true party public key, not the sender's public key, is used for decryption. Okay, so that's point of frequent confusion. I think we have talked enough about this point. Let's move on. Finding the true party public key. So what do we do that? How do we find that? Okay, uh, we cannot use the sender's public key because we don't know. The sender might have actually sent you a fraud public key. It's claiming to be Google. It sends you its public key saying, "Hey, look, I'm Google." Well, that's not good enough, right? So we need to that to be provided by something called a certificate authority. Okay, the certificate authority needs to be trustworthy. So we have um, a, a, a whole bunch of uh, certificate authority, and I'll name one, like for example, VeriSign, that can actually act as a certificate authority and will provide you true certificates, right? These are certificates that are valid, that they have verified that it's coming from the sender. Your browser actually already has a collection of all these certificates that are well known. It also knows the certificate authorities, and it knows how to get to the certificate authority to check if the certificates are to get you the correct certificate. So browser does a lot of heavy lifting for you. So if you look at any digital certificate that is coming from certificate authority, it'll tell you a bunch of information like subject, public key, um, public key algorithm, and so forth. So I'm going to pop open my browser to show you. For example, let's say, and I'm going to go to, let's say, wikipedia.org. You can see this little icon. Hopefully you can see it. I'm going to lower this a little bit so I can see it well. So we're talking about this. If you click on this, it'll ask you show certificate over here, and if you take a look at the details of this certificate, so if I open the detail, you can see that it shows you public key information, the algorithm used for the public key itself, key size, key, and what is the algorithm used for the key, which is RSA, the signature itself, right? Um, and you can actually copy the entire signature by just clicking on it, and you can see the signature right here, right? Um, there we go. So let's go back to our slides. So as you can see that it serial number allows the receiver to check if the digital certificate has been revoked by the CA. So this serial number right here is very important, right? You can check with the certificate authority to see if this serial number has already been revoked. Okay, and then you have the certificate provides a true party's public key, right? So true party's public key, that is the true party in this case. You might be trying to verify Wikipedia. It tells you that this is Wikipedia's public key. So you should be able to use that key when you're trying to verify or authenticate what you're meaning. So the other thing that you have to know is the digital certificate is signed by a certain certificate authority. The certificate authority signs the cert with its own private key, so that the cert's validity can be checked for alterations. Okay, so you can even look at the cert and say, has this certificate itself been compromised? And you can certainly look at that and figure out whether it has been it's valid or not. So if you look at digital certificate for google.com, for example, in this slide, you see that the public key is available right here. So the digital certificate has a digital signature of its own and is signed by the certificate authority, like we saw, must be tested with CA's well-known public key. If the test works, the certificate is authentic and unmodified. You can check for the valid period for the certificate. So let's go back to our certificate that we were viewing, uh, and I'm going to open the certificate up again, show the certificate, and go into the details. And as you can see, if I scroll here, you would see it says it's going to be valid, uh, not valid before Thursday, July 15, 2021, and not valid after Wednesday, October 13, 2021. Okay, that is this for this certificate. If the current time is not within the valid period, reject this digital certificate. And then checking for revocations. So certificates may be revoked for improper behavior or other reasons. For example, it was determined that one of the certificate authorities was not working uh, honestly, for lack of other words, and they wanted to revoke all the certificates that were issued by that certificate authority. So what they did was they went in and took all the certificates that were issued, and they added them to the revocation list. So if you go to the certificate authority and check for that serial number, you will see that it has been revoked. It's important for us to check that. Receiver must check with the CA. So the responsibility is with you, the receiver, to check with CA to see if it is a valid certificate still. Verifier may download the entire certificate revocation list from CA, see if the serial number is on the certificate. If so, do not accept the certificate. May send a query to CA asking for a specific certificate, whether that serial number is valid or not. Okay, so I'm going to go over it very fast. Digital signature comes in. You can authenticate it. If the public key is true, verifies the digital signature, accept the supplicant. And the certificate authority, on the other hand, is verified and must know the CA's public key to test. You get the digital certificate from the CA, and you check to make sure authenticate that certificate that you just got. Okay. Message by message authentication also brings message integrity. That means message if it has been altered, the authentication method will fail automatically, right? And we do that using digital signature authentication, the public key encryption for authentication, um, very strong but expensive. And then we use the key hash method authentication code. It is much less expensive than digital authentication, much more widely used. So what is a HMAC, or hashed message authentication code? What the sender would do is they add the key to the original plain text like so, right? Then what they do is they hash the combination with this combination with SHA-224, 256, 384, 512, etc. No encryption at this point. You just created a hash, and thereby you create the HMAC, which is the key hash message authentication code. Okay, now you append the HMAC to the plain text and you transmit that. Okay, you transmit with confidentiality. Okay, what do you mean by that? That means you are actually encrypting it so nobody else can peek into it and read it. Okay. As in case with a digital signature, confidentiality is done to protect the plain text. It is not needed for authentication and has nothing to do with authentication. Okay. So remember, the transmission of any information, you are keeping that confidential, but it has nothing to do with the authentication part. Hopefully you understand that. Any communication that you're sending over the wire, you're going to make sure that nobody else reads it. And that's the confidentiality part. And you are going to just basically encrypt the message as it goes over the wire. So remember, in the previous text, we took HMAC, we put it with original plain text, and we sent it over the wire, and you did encryption on the wire for that. And on the receiver end, okay, what's the receiver going to do? They look at that. First, they obviously decrypt the message as it comes through, and when they get the key, they hash with SHA-224, 256, 384, or SHA-512, whichever they have head shook with. They calculate the HMAC, and they look at the transmitted HMAC and see if they match. If they're equal, then the message has not been tampered with. Okay. So that way they always know that they are reading what they're supposed to be reading. Very important part with security is non-repudiation. What is non-repudiation? Non-repudiation means that sender cannot deny that he or she sent a message. Interesting, right? Um, so what is going on here is that, remember, your private key is your private key. So if I am able to send a message as you to somebody else, if you have not created the message using your private key, you can always say, hey, I did not send that message, right? But if your private key has been used or has been compromised and somebody used it for creating a message, well, you cannot claim that it is not from you unless you can prove that the private key that is no longer private. And just to let you know, I mean, it's very hard for you to win such cases in court if you cannot prove that you were working hard, um, uh, you know, to protect your private key. So at packet level, non-repudiation is unimportant in most cases. It's not at the packet level, but at the application level, the email message, contract, etc., it's an important thing, right? So the packet showing up, whether you send the packet or not, is not important. In fact, you would not probably be sending the packets directly. It kind of came through several hops and may even be rewritten. But the content of that packet, which has the application level data, which is like an email message, contract, etc., are important. If the application layer message has its own digital signature, you have non-repudiation for the application message, even if you use HMAC at the internet layer for packet authentication. Hopefully that's self-explanatory. So what is a replay attack? We kind of throwing this in there. What you can do is you can capture and retransmit the encrypted message. That is, that will create a replay. It may have a desired effect, right? Let's say if you wanted to, you did a payment of some sort. So you create a payment which is much smaller, but then you kind of replayed the payment over and over again to every time have some money transferred, let's say. And because the messages are going in as if they are coming from the original sender, it might have the same desired effect. So what do you do? What you end up doing is thwarting the replay attack is through timestamps. So in other words, if you're replaying them, the timestamps are stale now, so it's not going to work. Or you put a sequence number in there, so the messages are showing up in sequence and they cannot be repeated because you would have broken the sequence. Or you use something called nonce. Nonce is a randomly generated number placed in each request message, and it's important that the nonces are used only once by definition, right? So if a request arrives with a previously used nonce, it is rejected. That means I have this random number, I've seen this random number before, I'm not going to work with this, okay? So obviously nonces mean that you have to have some kind of a track going on where you are recording all the nonces that you've seen, so you can reject the nonce that is being repeated. So now we're going to summarize some of these concepts that you saw. Important, very important, big boulders here. Symmetric key encryption, we talked about it. You know, it is when both parties have the same key, right? So confidentiality is applicable. That means nobody else is going to be able to intercept that message, right? Authentication is not applicable. Why? Because it's both parties have the key. As party B, you could have created the message yourself and send it yourself and say, hey, Alice created this. And Bob can go to court and claim Alice created. Alice says, I did not create it. But since Bob has the key, he could have created it on Alice's behalf, right? Hopefully you get that. Public key encryption, okay? Is there confidentiality there? Yes, of course, nobody else can read it, right? Sender encrypts with the receiver's public key, receiver decrypts with the receiver's own private key. Is authentication applicable? Yes. Why? Because the sender have to have their own private key to have created message. The receiver can decrypt with the public key from the true party, right? So if there's a message that came in and you went to the certificate authority, asked for Google's public key, and you decrypted the message, then it must be from Google. You can take it to court. Why? Because only Google is supposed to have a private key to have created that message. Okay, in hashing, it says not applicable, confidentiality. Why? It's very simple, right? Because hashing actually is irreversible. So there's no confidentiality. Even if somebody just opens the message up, including the receiver, by itself, hashing is not going to offer anything at all. I mean, it's not even readable at that point. Authentication is applicable. Why? Because in MS Chat, if you saw that, there was an initial authentication, an HMAC for the message authentication. So you actually established in MS Chat, initially you exchange a challenge, and then you send the hash of the challenge that later on in message by message, you can actually use that challenge to constantly see if the hashing matches of where you send it from. So in other words, it is actually the person that you send the initial challenge to that is sending the message. So hashing definitely provides authentication. Quantum security. So I'm going to really skip over this, go a little fast. I would encourage you to read the book. We are already over an hour, and I want to make sure that I don't make this any longer than it needs to be. So I would implore you to read the book. What it boils down to is that with quantum computing, the power of computing is going up. Remember, you can make it hard for cryptography to crack anything, but it's not impossible. It's just that it's going to take such a long time with all the different combinations of keys that you have that it's not going to be even worth it. But with advent of quantum computing, you're going to see that this so-called computation that you thought are going to take you months and even years can now be done in a matter of hours or minutes. Now, that's going to be a challenge, right? So it is going to be totally worth trying to crack a brute force in any kind of encryption. So what do you have to do? Well, you have to make your keys longer. So it takes even longer time for you to do the calculations using, you know, crypto analysis. All right. So finally, we're gonna look at a cryptographic system where client PC and server are talking to each other. It could be, for example, your browser asking for data from Wikipedia. So first thing that happens is you're gonna select a cryptographic system. Like for example, you'll say, what are the standards? Are we going to use TLS? Are we going to use IPsec? Once you've determined that, then you say, this is the cipher suite I'm going to use, server. Are you ready to give me that? So once you've done that, you are now in this stage where you're doing the handshaking. So it's a three-way handshaking, right? You're negotiating the security method, like I said, and then you are doing, establishing an authentication, which is usually mutual authentication that you're doing. That means server is checking out who PC is, and PC is checking out who the server is, right? And then finally, you do a key that you create a secret key that both of you now have, so you can use it for what? For symmetric encryption of the rest of the messages, right? So that's your last part. So ongoing communication is message by message is using that symmetric key. You still have your authentication going on because you can use something like MSCHAP or HMAC for doing that for message integrity, right? Another topic that I'm gonna skip over is finding out what virtual private networks do, and you can see and you can study this a little bit more in your book. There are various different ways of creating VPNs. So first one is host to host, where two hosts are connected, or it's a remote access VPN where a remote PC connects to a bunch of resources, or you have site-to-site VPNs where two sites are connected to each other and they all show a tunnel, and the tunnel provides you encryption, right? Okay, let's talk a little bit about IP security. There are two modes: tunnel mode and transport mode. Let's take a look at those, and it's fairly simple. Um, as you can see in transport mode, it's an end-to-end security. This is really good. Why? Because of security in the site network is good. So when you go through the internet, you are already secure, but as you reach the site where you're trying to get to, you are secured there as well. So the tunnel kind of exists all the way through to the machine. That's the transport mode. Okay, so this is why is this not so popular? Well, there is setup cost, so it is costly. So while this is great, you have end-to-end security. Nobody can peek at your data, but you are only going to use it when you really need it, right? Compared to this, the tunnel mode, as you can see that it actually terminates the connection, the security, or the tunnel, I should say, terminates at the IPsec server. Okay, an IPsec server sends it to the site network. Now it is inside the network. It's not on the internet, but no, it's no longer secured, right? So no security in the site network, and the setup cost is so much easier. So it is good, right? No setup cost on each of the hosts. So that's the payoff, if you would, of going with this system. Although you're limiting your connection security to the tunnel connection here over the internet, you are actually not secured when you are entering or exiting a network. So within the network, there is no security. Again, comparing the IPsec transport and tunnel mode, it kind of goes through exactly what we just saw. Setup cost, comparison of cryptographic protection, IPsec VPN gateway. In transport mode, you don't necessarily use it, but in the tunnel mode, you do have to use them, right? Um, and then firewall friendliness. In transport mode, it's bad because firewall at the border of a site cannot filter packets because the content is encrypted, while it is good in the tunnel mode. So I want to just kind of wanted to go over that just for a few seconds. If I go back here, if you remember here, I can actually create the firewall on the IPsec server and take a look at what is coming through, and this is, I can even make it a firewall that is looking at application level data. In other words, it's like opened up the packets and it's looking at the application level to make sure that it is safe. But as compared to that, if I actually were to use the transport mode, there is no such device. So firewalls are no good here. It is end-to-end encrypted, so they can uh, pass through firewall. Even if I were to look at the data packet, data inside the packet is still encrypted. There's no way I can get to it. So that is the big difference here. And finally, IPsec Security Association. The Security Association is an agreement on what security method and option the two hosts or two IPsec gateways will use during their communication, right? So there's an IPsec policy server that can sit independently, and it can send the list of allowable security association and let these two parties negotiate with each other exactly how they want to create the tunnel, if you would, or provide IP security. Well, that was fairly long. Um, it, I appreciate you joining me for this chapter. Hopefully you enjoyed it. And again, I want to implore you guys to go read the book because it offers a lot more detail than I could cover here. And I still kind of ran over an hour here. So hopefully you'll read the chapter and gain a lot more information. I appreciate you joining. Thank you, and I'll see you for the next chapter.